Hey y'all, welcome back to our series on common mistakes authors make when pitching podcasts and how to fix or avoid them. This is Book Marketing Mania, and I'm your host, Kim Stewart. And last week on episode 56, we talked about the common mistake of pitching without a plan and how to fix it by creating your podcast pitching strategy. So now you know your goals for pitching, the audience you want to reach, the topics you'll talk about, and the types of shows you want to reach. So it's time to load up lots of podcast host email addresses and send away, right? But before you do, let's talk about common podcast pitching mistake number 3, cold pitching the masses. And I'll share how you can fix or avoid that mistake in the future. So let's get to it. So what do I mean by cold pitching the masses? Cold pitching is where we reach out to a podcast host without having made any kind of connection ahead of time. The relationship is cold, right? Now you might ask, isn't that the point? Aren't we guesting on podcasts to reach new readers that we don't have a relationship with? Yes, absolutely. That's your goal of podcast guesting. But it starts with the podcast host who is serving those listeners today. And if you've listened to episode 9 with my guest, Misty Phillip, host of the By His Grace podcast and founder of the Spark Network for Christian Podcasters, we talked about cold pitching. And she said, if you really want to be a guest on multiple shows, take an interest in the podcast. Know what they're talking about, and make friends with podcasters because you're going to get a lot further than a cold pitch that says, I'm so interested in your podcast, when it's clear you've never listened to their show and you don't know what they talk about. Such great advice. And so let's talk about pitching the masses. I mean, as Christian writers, shouldn't we be taking the spray and pray approach, y'all? And if we want to use our time wisely, like we talked about in the last episode, wouldn't that be the best way to do it? Y'all, yes, pray over your podcast pitching strategy. But taking the spray and pray approach to pitching is just sending out mass pitches and hoping something sticks. There's no strategy to it. So when clients come to me that have been pitching themselves with no success, they ask, what am I doing wrong? And they share that they heard a big online influencer teach to mass pitch podcast, and you'll get on a ton of shows. But when they try that, it doesn't work. Go figure. Well, if you're a big-time influencer with a huge platform and a huge team to support your pitching, sure, that might work. And podcast hosts might even be lucky to have you as a guest and already have you on their dream list of guests. But if you're not one of those huge influencers with a big platform, well, imagine that's why you click play on this episode, right? So the problem with loading up your email box with lots of host email addresses and just hitting send is it will come across cold, and as we talked about, and it doesn't allow for you to evaluate what's working and what's not. Remember, with podcast pitching, sometimes this is the first impression you're making on a podcast host, right? Your email asking them for something in their inbox. And if you haven't warmed up the relationship first, then it's going to feel super cold and sometimes slimy because believe me, podcast hosts can spot a pitch template downloaded from the internet a mile away. And we've talked about this before. Guesting can lead to so many things when it comes down to the relationship between you and the host. So you don't want the first impression to be a super cold pitch asking them for something in their inbox. And remember back in episode 55, I shared some common responses you might hear back from your pitch that are basically no's, right? Even crickets. Well, is it because you're pitching them cold? Is it because you're pitching shows that interview guests with lots of guesting experience and you're just hoping to land your first interview? Is it because they've already covered the topic you're pitching on their show? Is it because they don't even take guest submissions? You'll never know the answer if you don't give yourself time to review your strategy and see what's working with your podcast pitching and what's not. Okay, so how can we fix or avoid the common mistake of cold pitching the masses? Number 1, warm up the relationship first. Simply listen to the show and leave a podcast review. A little bit goes a long way in a podcast host's mind, and leaving a podcast review is huge to a podcast host. And be sure to mention in your pitch too if you've left a review. And then you can also follow them on social media and engage authentically with their post, especially about their podcast. I share more about building relationships with podcast hosts on episode 44 and episode 15. Plus, tune into episode 50, where Instagram and online marketing coach Ruthie Gray gave some great suggestions on building authentic relationships on social media. Then number 2 for fixing or avoiding the mistake of cold pitching the masses is to simply pitch a few shows at a time. And that way you can see what you're getting back from your pitches. Are you hearing yeses? Are you hearing nos? Are you hearing, we've already covered that topic? Instead of just cold mass pitching all at one time, and then you don't get a chance to kind of tweak your strategy or tweak your pitch. And if you're getting a ton of yeses from your pitches, yay, it's time to celebrate. And this would also give you time to tweak your topics and find other topics and stories to share. So when it comes time to promote your interview, it doesn't look like you're saying the same thing over and over and over. Oh goodness, y'all, that's a whole episode in itself. So warm up the relationship with the podcast host first and pitch just a few shows at a time, and you'll avoid the common podcast pitching mistake of cold pitching the masses. Next week, we'll tackle common podcast pitching mistake number 4, sending cookie cutter pitches. And yep, that's different than cold mass pitching, and I can't wait to talk about it. I hope you're enjoying this series. Be sure to follow the show in your podcast player so you don't miss an episode. And I want to give a shout out to one of my listeners who left a review of the show. Amber says, "So much value. Thank you, Kim, for pouring your heart into the show and sharing so many helpful strategies. This is a must listen podcast." Thank you, Amber. That feedback means the world to me. And I'd be so grateful if you too left a review of the show so other Christian authors can come and learn how to build their platforms and market their books by guesting on podcast. And if you're listening the week this episode airs, I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I'll see you back here next week. Can't wait.